that Anchorage is situated on is the traditional land of the Dena'ina, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the Dena'ina people, past, present, and future. And tonight, I especially want to welcome, we have folks signed in from around the state: Anchor Point, Denali Park, Fairbanks, Hoonah, Kotzebue, Juneau, and we go beyond to Salt Lake City, and even somebody is registered, at least from Munich, where it's 6 a.m. So good morning to the folks in Munich if you're online. We'd like to thank our sponsors for this series of events: the Alaska Conservation Foundation, GCI, the Alaska Center, Anchorage Solid Waste Services, Cook Inlet Keeper, and Blue Market Alaska. We'd also like to thank our partners: the UAA APU Books of the Year, the Anchorage Public Library, the League of Women Voters of Anchorage, and the Renewable Energy Alaska Project, also known as REAP. We could not conduct the work we do without the support of our members and donors. If you would like to support events like this, please consider becoming a member or making a donation online at Alaska Common Ground, all one word, .org. We'll put a link in the chat. Again, please donate or join. A couple housekeeping and voting items. Everyone's audio has been muted this evening except for the presenters. The event is being recorded in case you or your friends would like to watch it later. If you want to ask questions or provide feedback during the event, we are asking those to be presented to us through Zoom's chat feature. The chat box is at the bottom of your screen. We'll collect your questions and the moderator will ask them after the panelist presentations. The event will run to about 8:30. Before we introduce the moderator, we want to take a few minutes and share a video produced by Cook Inlet Keeper describing the idea of taking action from the middle out. In addition to individual actions, things like replacing your light bulbs with LEDs and top-down policies like carbon taxes, working from the middle out in our communities gives each of us more ways to take action on climate and increase our impact. So with that, Kari should be sharing the video.
Hi, I'm Kagan Koski, a student from Alaska's Kenai Peninsula. My community is working to reverse climate change. In just the past year, we've brought solar power to tons of homes in our area and started neighborhood composting. To do this, we use the overlooked superpower of middle-out change. Change can start from the bottom up with personal decisions like recycling, composting, and gardening at home. And change can start with big institutions, rewriting laws and policies from the top down. Often, we get hung up on these two areas of change. Individual actions sometimes feel too small, and top-down change sometimes takes too long. Our toolkit doesn't look at change from the top down or bottom up, but from a space too many people ignore, the middle out. Keep recycling, but look outside your home as well. Keep signing big petitions, but don't forget the power of your community. You have tremendous influence at the local level. Living where we live and being part of a community gives us all the power for meaningful climate action. Working together with our neighbors, let's unleash climate solutions from the middle out. To learn more and to download our action kit, please visit our website.
Thank you to Cook Inlet Keeper for that video. One of our goals with hosting this series has been to suggest many ways we could each work on climate action from top down to bottom up and also from the middle out. We have collected actions you can take from the panelists in this series, which you can find on our climate resources page. And there's a link being shared with you on how to find that. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Susanna Caldwell. Susanna is the recycling coordinator for the Municipality of Anchorage Department of Solid Waste Services. She joined Solid Waste Services in September 2017 And since then, she has worked to raise the city's recycle rate through new programs and market development and improved education and outreach. In her tenure at Solid Waste Services, notable projects include leading implementation of the city's first ever curbside organics collection program, relaunching commercial glass recycling, and partnering with the Anchorage School District to establish new community recycling sites. Her background is in communications. Before joining Solid Waste Services, she studied journalism and public communications at the University of Alaska Anchorage and spent over a decade working as a reporter in Alaska. Susanna grew up in Wasilla and is proud to call Anchorage home. And with that introduction, I will turn it over to our moderator for tonight, Susanna Caldwell.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick. And thank you to everyone at Alaska Common Ground for helping to organize this. I am so excited to be with you tonight and to talk trash for a good portion of the evening. So with that, let's start with a poll. Kari, if you could go ahead and load that up. I have a question for everybody tonight. And if you don't see the poll for some reason, click on the, the green words poll in process to bring it up. And so the question that we're asking folks tonight is, how many pounds of waste per day does an Anchorage resident throw away? So we have a couple options there. I'll give folks a second to figure it out. Okay, it's interesting to see this in real time. I'm really curious what you all think. Oh my goodness, okay. Okay, nice. All right. Well, okay, we've got a good portion of everyone who's voted. It looks like 5 pounds per day is coming in as the winner. And you guys are trash experts because that is correct. The Anchorage resident in 2020, the average Anchorage resident threw away actually about 5.5 pounds of trash per person per day. And this actually is higher than the national average. The national average for the amount of trash that gets thrown away per person per day is 4.4 pounds per person per day. So we're throwing away more. There's kind of some complicated reasons for that. You know, the Anchorage economy is doing okay, right? And so when economies are doing well, people are definitely purchasing more items. And so, of course, when an item gets purchased, it also has to get thrown away at the end of its life. And so part of that is the reason why we might see just an uptick in consumption, right? But then also, you know, we do have some challenges when it comes to recycling and just dealing with our overall waste. And so I'm going to talk to you about that tonight, and our presenters will also talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to introduce the panelists very quickly before I get started. Tonight, I'm joined by Anita Nelson. She is the Executive Director of Alaskans for Litter Prevention and Recycling. We also have Jennifer Gordon. She's the co-owner and founder of Blue Market AK. And then finally, I'm joined by Jody Anderson of the UAF Matanuska Experiment Farm and Extension Center. Now, I'd like to remind everyone, we are taking questions and we will be answering those after all of our presenters have gone through their presentations. So please go ahead and enter your questions in the chat and we'll get to them later on in the evening. So with that, I'm going to talk to you all about consumption and solid waste. So let me just pull that up. All right. So consumption and solid waste. This is one of 7 sectors that was outlined in the Climate Action Plan. It's one that I worked on in terms of developing. And I think it's a really interesting one, right? It's one that people can engage in every day, even if they don't really think about it, right? Everyone is producing trash at some level, right? Every visitor that comes into our community, every single person. And with that, we all have a chance to make a choice, right? In terms of what we decide to do with that thing that we're buying or we're throwing away. And so that's what we really focused on when it came to the consumption and solid waste chapter, because there are definitely ways that by making certain choices, we can help reduce our overall emissions and our overall climate impact. Sorry. So just very briefly, I want to just give an overview of the Anchorage trash and recycling system. So, we just polled you on how much trash each person is throwing away per day. But what that works out to annually here in Anchorage is that we end up collecting 300,000 tons of garbage at the Anchorage Regional Landfill annually. The Anchorage Regional Landfill is the only landfill in the municipality of Anchorage, and it is the final depository for all trash that's collected here. 300,000 tons, that's a big number. What does that mean? Well, to give you some sense of the scale of the trash that we're collecting, we collect enough trash to fill up the equivalent of the BP building, or the former BP building, every month. So there is a tremendous amount of waste that's being generated in our community. And of that, only 24,000 tons of recycling gets processed at the Anchorage Recycling Center each year. And so obviously that's a much smaller portion of our overall waste stream, and one that we're working to correct. There are some challenges there, of course, but one that here in the municipality we're working to improve. So when it comes to emissions related to consumption and solid waste, there are a few areas where we see the most emissions being created. Of course, there's manufacturing, right? The manufacturing of new products is very energy intensive, especially if you're using virgin materials. So within that sector, we see a lot of energy being used. It's one that within the climate action plan, we don't have a ton of control over because we don't have a lot of manufacturing in Alaska. So, we're really dependent on outside sources to bring, goods into our community. So don't have a lot of control there, but as consumers, we do have a lot of control in terms of what we do and don't buy. We also see a lot of emissions created as a result of transportation of those goods into our community, whether it's via barge or plane or being trucked in or anything like that. And with that, we do have opportunities to find efficiencies within those systems. And then, of course, there's just emissions that are created in the collection and disposal of the solid waste that we have in our community. So, for example, a garbage truck here in Anchorage, it averages about 3 gallons per mile. It's a very inefficient way to transport things. They start and stop, they're big and heavy. And so there is a lot of fuel being used in the collection of our trash. So we work really hard to try to make the routes more efficient. And one thing Solid Waste Services is looking into is that we're looking at electrifying our fleet and adding electric garbage trucks. So we are not so dependent on the diesel fuel that powers those trucks every day. And then, of course, a really big one is landfill methane and the emissions that are caused from that. When you bury organic material in a landfill, it decomposes anaerobically. And when you do that, you create methane, which is a really potent greenhouse gas. Now, the picture I have in the slide here shows you the landfill, and you see the pipe. That's part of the gas collection system that we have at the Anchorage Regional Landfill, because we are collecting all of that methane that is being generated as part of the natural decomposition process. With that methane, we send about 2/3 of it to a power plant on Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. So it's going for use as an alternative fuel. But we still end up flaring about 1/3 of it, and because we're destroying it, because we don't want it to go into the environment. That said, one thing that we're going to talk about tonight, especially with food waste reduction and composting, is how to get that organic material out of the landfill so it's not producing methane in the first place. So, it can be kind of hard to think about, our overall emissions when it comes to consumption and solid waste, and the way that individual choices can make any sort of difference when it comes to reducing our overall greenhouse gas emissions. And so I just want to talk about this graphic really quick to just give you kind of a sense of the scale of how the individual actions can really lead into big changes. So if you look at scenario 1, it's looking at what happens if you just throw away 100 tons of paper, right? And so if you think about the whole lifespan of that product, from the trees being harvested to having to have those logs transported to a paper manufacturer, going to the mill, getting transported to the resident who then throws it away, and then it gets picked up by a trash truck, and then it gets buried in the landfill. There's a lot of energy that's being used in that process. It's the equivalent of 109 metric tons of carbon equivalent, which works out to about the equivalent of 12,000 gallons of gasoline being burned, right? It's a lot of energy, it's a lot of emissions. Now, if we were to just do something simple like recycling half of that paper, right? If you think about the lifespan of how that will work, fewer trees end up being harvested to make more paper. There are fewer logs being transported. The paper then goes to a paper mill where, they're manufacturing paper, not having to use that virgin material. The paper is still collected and still recycled, but ultimately it ends up being a lot less emissions, right? It's only 40 metric tons of carbon equivalent, which works out to about 4,500 gallons of gasoline. So small changes can really add up to big savings when it comes to this sector. That said, there are challenges here in Anchorage when it comes to our recycling system. I know Anita will talk a bit more about this, but the way I try to describe it to folks is that recycling in Anchorage, it functions kind of like we're on an island, right? We don't really have much manufacturing, and the way traditional commodities recycling works, and when I talk about the commodities recycling, I'm talking about the things that most people are familiar with, like paper and number 1 and number 2 plastic and aluminum and that sort of thing that's getting recycled. Typically how it would work is you would collect that material and then you would send it to a paper mill or a aluminum smelting plant or something like that, where it would get turned into new materials. Since we don't have that kind of manufacturing up here, we have to send out most of the material that we collect to the lower 48. That limits to a degree what we can and can't accept, right? Because it's all based on commodities markets and how markets are working, what's available for recycling, that sort of thing. So we're always looking for new end markets. We're always looking for ways that we can keep more recycled products here, which is one thing I'll talk about in a minute. I will say one thing that's really great about our current recycling system, even though it definitely has its challenges, is that we work to ship all of the recycling that we collect on backhaul from that's donated from the shipping companies, which I know Anita will talk more about. But it's really great in terms of, I know folks often have a lot of concerns over energy that's expended in terms of moving recycled products across the globe or down to the lower 48, and is it all worth it? But what happens is the shipping containers are coming up to Alaska with consumer goods in them, right? And then we're buying those goods, and then we have these products and we have to figure out what to do with the end of life of it. However, the shipping containers, there's no manufacturing, so there's nothing going back on those containers. They're empty containers. They still have to go back to go get more goods. And so we leverage them by putting the recyclables in as backhaul. So we're just, those are containers that we're going to go down anyway, and we just utilize that to our benefit. So we do have challenges, but we do have some things that we are recycling really quickly, because I know that folks in Anchorage are really excited about them. So one of the most popular programs that we have in Anchorage is glass recycling. Glass recycling has been around in Anchorage for a long time. It had fits and starts over the years, but we restarted it in September of 2012. And since then, the program has been going really strong. We end up collecting about 1,200 tons of glass per year. What we do with that glass, it stays local. It doesn't get shipped to the lower 48 or anything like that. We end up grinding it up into something that we call recycled glass aggregate, which is then sold for construction projects like pipe bedding and fill projects and that sort of thing. It's been going so well that the last few years, we've actually been able to expand the collection of this material. We've expanded some drop-off locations. Last summer, we added glass recycling at East Anchorage High School. We have a small recycling site there, and we're actually looking at adding a few more locations, hopefully very soon. We're just working on some kind of final details there. And we also launched a commercial glass collection program in 2019 that was specifically targeted at bars and restaurants, because we know that those are large generators of glass. So it's something that's been really exciting for us to continue to expand this. And again, to continue to find local markets for recycling whenever we can. The other thing we've been working really hard on, and I know Jody will talk more about this topic in detail later tonight, is organics recycling. Organics is really important to us here at Solid Waste Services because it makes up about 25% of all residential solid waste. And we know that if we were able to collect a majority of it, we could collect, up to 90,000 tons of material per year, which is that's a lot of material, which not only is that saving space within the landfill, which has a lifespan, it could end, and it will end at some point. Right now we have about 44 years left in its life, but also this organic material is what's causing the methane to be produced, and we don't want to produce any more methane. So when you take this out of the waste stream and you use it to make compost, not only are you reducing those methane emissions, but you're also creating compost, which is a great soil amendment, which helps us grow more food. So lots of benefits across the board there. And so a couple programs we've been working really hard at expanding is the Curbside Organics program, where we collect food scraps and yard trimmings in a bin that you just put out at your curb, just like you would with your regular trash and recycling, as well as continuing to develop our community compost program, which is just for food scraps. And those are, it's a free program with drop-off locations at both the landfill and the transfer station. Both of these programs are just getting ready to start next week. So finally, what can you do? And I'm gonna throw something out there that I'm sure if you follow solid waste and trash and recycling, you've heard it before. It's the 3 R's, right? It's reduce. Think about what you are buying when you buy it, or the things that you are consuming, right? So whether that's something simple as like making sure you have a water bottle with you at all times, if you need to drink water instead of having to buy a new water bottle, or something that I know a lot of folks are participating in now is that we're all getting so much takeout. Remind folks when you're getting that takeout, I don't need the plastic cutlery, I don't need that kind of stuff, right? Just thinking about these small things that we can do to reduce our overall waste can ultimately lead to really big impacts. The other thing I would remind people to do is reuse, right? Buy things secondhand if you can. If you have something that still has some life in it, whether it's a piece of furniture or even something like a yogurt container that you can't recycle, you have to throw it away, but maybe you can use it for an art project or something like that. I would just consider, try to get as much life out of the things that you are purchasing for as long as you can. And then ultimately, when something comes to the end of its life, recycle it, right? And this also goes back to thinking about what you're buying. Buy products, that can be recycled, that won't just get landfilled. Make sure you're participating in the composting programs when you can, right? Just do all these little things because they can have a really big impact at the end of the day. So that's my presentation. But I'm not quite done with you all yet because we have a little recycling quiz. And so I'm going to show a couple items and I want you to tell me whether or not they are recyclable in Anchorage. And the way I would like you to do this is go into the reaction screen on your Zoom, click on it. And if something is recyclable, I want you to click yes when I hold it up. If it's not, I would like you to click no. So I'm going to start really quick. The first thing I have is a #1 plastic water bottle. It's really little, but it's still a #1 plastic bottle. It has a lid on it, or excuse me, a screw cap, and it has a label on it as well. So is this recyclable in Anchorage? I see yes. I see some yeses, some thumbs up too. Okay, good. You guys are like recycling experts. Yes, this is recyclable here in Anchorage. Even the screw cap is recyclable. I know folks have a lot of questions about that. But yeah, it's all recyclable. The label is recyclable. I would just encourage you, if it had any soda in it or juice or something, make sure to rinse it out just to keep your cart clean. But yeah, you can put this in your curbside recycle cart, or you can drop it off at numerous locations around Anchorage where we have #1 plastic recycling. The next thing I have is a #1 plastic clamshell. Is this recyclable in Anchorage? No. And just a reminder, the yes and no buttons are in your reactions tab at the bottom of your Zoom. It's okay. I'm seeing a lot of no's. I'm seeing some like worried faces. Perfect. Yes, you guys, experts. Yes, correct. This is not recyclable in Anchorage. They used to be recyclable in Anchorage, but what happened was markets changed. This kind of plastic, even though it's a #1 plastic, and that means it uses the same resin as that bottle. However, you can tell they're different. They're different things, right? And there's a different production process in making this clamshell versus making that bottle, and it makes it harder to recycle this clamshell. And there's just hardly any domestic markets in the United States that want to take this. And so most of these end up getting trashed. If you were to put them in your recycling, they would end up getting trashed. So don't put that in your recycling. The next thing I have is a piece of paperboard. This is an old oatmeal container. It has a little bit of a shiny paper on it. Is this recyclable here in Anchorage? Yes. Okay, seeing a lot of yeses. Again, you guys are nailing this quiz. You're so good. Yes, this is recyclable. This would go into your mixed paper, even though it almost seems like a cardboard, but it's considered mixed paper. And yeah, this is totally recyclable in both curbside recycling or at any mixed paper drop off. I have one more item for everybody. This is maybe one of my favorite things. It's a pizza box. It's a cardboard pizza box. And there's actually a little bit of grease on it and a little bit of food. Is this item recyclable in Anchorage? Okay, see a no. See some thumbs up. All right. The answer is yes. The greasy pizza boxes are accepted in our recycling here in Anchorage. This is a newer change. We used to ask folks that if there was any grease or any bit of food to tear that off and only recycle the clean parts. We worked with West Rock last year. They did a study that found that small amounts of grease and even little bits of cheese and stuff, it actually doesn't affect the ability to recycle cardboard. And so now we are accepting any pizza box. I would ask, the one request that I would have is that when you do put that in your recycling, try to break it down as much as you can. We're seeing a lot of cardboard these days, and across, not just pizza boxes, but all kinds. And one thing folks don't always do is break it down, and that ends up filling up the containers quickly, and they can overflow. And it just means that we're transporting containers filled with air. So try to break down your cardboard when you can, and that applies for your curbside recycling. If you have that at home, they can often get stuck in the carts and just make it difficult to empty. So, wow, recycling experts. I'm so proud of you all. You're fantastic. So, so with that, I am so excited to introduce my colleague, Anita Nelson. Anita is the Executive Director for ALPAR, which is the Alaskans for Litter Prevention and Recycling. This statewide nonprofit is dedicated to eliminating litter and increasing economically viable recycling in Alaska. Founded in 1982 by a group of dedicated business leaders, ALPAR's programs help clean up litter across Alaska's communities and assist community recycling centers along the rail belt with shipping assistance. Anita's tenure in Alaska has spanned both the nonprofit and for-profit worlds, focusing on advocacy, issues management, and tourism. Anita, I'm so excited to hear from you tonight. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. Well, thanks, Susanna. You hit a lot of great points, and I saw a lot of engaged audience members. I saw them nodding and looking surprised at some of the things and that they were excited about doing more recycling. So that's great. I'll talk about the ALPAR mission and how we fit in kind of to the overall spectrum, but really I wanted to first start with the big picture. And recycling fits into kind of what we've been talking about tonight, and that recycling helps the environment by saving energy, resources, and reducing waste. Secondly, what recycling looks like in Alaska depends on where you live. And if you've lived anywhere else in Alaska or otherwise, you know that our options vary widely. And thirdly, like Susanna was saying, is that recycling is a commodities market. I try to get people to think that it's not trash, and instead each item is a commodity that can be sorted and sold. And then also lastly, recycling in Alaska really becomes viable through partnerships. It's not us against them, it's us with them. So foremost, our geography really dictates a lot of what recycling looks like in Alaska. The municipal, borough, and village level groups have to work within their jurisdictions and within the confines of how they connect to road, rail, or river systems, very similar to like being on an island. When more than 80% of our state is not connected by roads, that means we have to get creative, and we also have to be realistic at the same time. So the result in Alaska is that it's a patchwork quilt, and those with a similar vision contribute to a piece of that fabric, and we try to cover as much of Alaska as possible. So if you live in Anchorage, you're very fortunate. You've got more options than the majority of the state, and as you get a call to action from various presenters today, think about how you can play a role. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about ALPAR. Like Susanna said, we're a nonprofit. We've been around for almost 40 years. And we've got a two-part mission. The first part is litter prevention, and the second part is economically viable recycling. And for this part, I'll focus on the latter. ALPAR is a tiny nonprofit which aims to have a big impact. We have an all-volunteer board, we've got donated office space, and 1 employee. That's me. And we work with about 450 different entities across the state. And depending on our fiscal situation, we have operate about 6 programs. So how do you have a big impact with no equipment, 1 employee, and a shoestring budget? Well, when it comes to recycling in relation to our mission, we really play a very specific role, and that has to do with our capacity that comes from operating at the 30,000 foot level and harnessing the power of private businesses who have the equipment, expertise, and employees to collect and move things, the majority of which is done on a donated basis. It's through their contributions that much of recycling in Alaska is possible. So geographically, we focus on 2 areas because that's where we have our legacy support. We focus on the rail belt and Bush, Alaska. And I'll get more into those details later, but the result is about 1,000 shipping containers per year are kept out of landfills and moved on to recycling in the lower 48. And if you took those and stacked them one on top of the other, it would stretch more than 1.5 miles into the sky each year. So while it may seem frustrating for some, there's still a lot of good that's happening, and it's a far cry from where we were in the 80s with just 29 containers. So now I'll move on to ALPAR and really how we facilitate the movement of those recyclables out of Alaska. And I'll just reiterate that our programming is really focused on where we get support from private industry. So in the rail belt, what happens is that the Alaska Railroad allows us to move recyclables for free from Fairbanks to the Port of Alaska or to Whittier. Specifically, we work with recycling centers in Fairbanks, the Valley, and Anchorage. And their material is moved over the water by Matson Tote or AML Linden. Again, this is all donated, as Susanna said, and these are empty containers which came up and with goods in them, and now they were being sent back with recyclables in them. So it's a good use of those containers. In the recycling centers in each of those areas has the responsibility to find buyers for that material that's collected, and each center varies in what and how materials are collected. So in Anchorage, we've got a lot of options. In the Valley, not as many options, and in Fairbanks, even fewer. But again, besides municipal and borough things that are happening, there are also private companies who are offering pickup services for recycling for a fee. So I wanted to touch a little bit on markets and commodity prices. So recycling, again, it's a commodity. So it's going to depend on whether or not someone wants it. Secondly, what someone is willing to pay for it. And lastly, the cost to get that commodity to the buyer. And that last part is where ALPAR has its value by lending a hand and getting shipping agreements with the railroad, over the water shippers, and the trucking companies. And those who follow the industry, like Susanna had mentioned, that there was a China ban on taking US imports, and that included recyclables, which meant the US had to adjust not only to the economic impacts of the pandemic and changes in consumer habits. All of a sudden, everybody was, instead of going to brick and mortar, they're shopping online. And what are you going to do with all that waste? So when the pandemic first hit, a lot of solid waste companies were reporting up to 30% increase in residential volumes, while at the same time their commercial volumes were dropping. So basically, there were more people at home full time, who spurred massive cleaning also during those hunker down periods. In addition, commodity prices for paper and cardboard have made a very volatile. They've been ups and down. So you remember when everybody was trying to buy and find toilet paper? Well, interesting enough, cardboard prices nationally fell to the lowest level in 2 decades at the end of 2019. And then prices began to rise, due in part to the cardboard shortage coinciding with the increased demand for paper packaging to meet the influx of e-commerce during what we people call the pandemic holiday season, also known as the Amazon effect. There were lots of cardboard boxes ending up on doorsteps instead of big box stores. So several new paper mills are coming online in the lower 48 this year, but it's taken a lot of time, and businesses are still really sensitive about investing in infrastructure like paper mills when they're not knowing what the future is going to hold. So at this time, I want to break this up a little bit, and Kari, if you could throw up the polling question. I'll give you a second to do that. So polling question is, how many times can an aluminum can beverage be recycled into a new can? So we'll let you have a moment there to kind of think about that one. Okay, well, we'll see, Kari, if we could throw up the answer there for folks. Ah, you guys are great. So infinitely, yes. Aluminum cans are endlessly recyclable. Every year, Americans send about 45 billion aluminum cans to the landfill. It's about 132 cans per person. The scrap value of that is about $800 million. And the energy savings is immense compared to making a new can from virgin materials. And that process not only helps with greenhouse gas emissions as well. So good for you if you're recycling aluminum cans, and if you're not, let's work on that and let's get it done. So I wanted to move on then to Bush, Alaska, since I know there's some folks on the line who are from different places throughout the state. So in Bush, Alaska, we on a lot smaller band of recycling. And again, it's based on our capacity and our history of support from members of the Alaska Air Carriers Association. So for communities where there's no option or entity to collect or barge out aluminum beverage cans through a local solid waste service provider, we offer a program called Flying Cans. And what we do is we ask them for empty, dry aluminum beverage cans that are collected, tagged, and bagged and flown on a space available basis to regional hubs by local carriers. They eventually make their way to a Northern Air Cargo facility, either in Anchorage or Fairbanks. And then if they land in Fairbanks, they're moved by rail to Anchorage. And if they land in Anchorage, they move by Alaska Waste to the Anchorage Recycling Center, where they're weighed and reports are sent to Alpar. So it's a bit of a game, like Susanna said, we have to really piece this all together. In rural Alaska right now, we've got about 75 to 80 villages per year that participate. And in 2020, they sent in almost 14 tons of aluminum beverage cans that were kept out of our landfills through that program. We also have a program called Flying Bottles that operates in a similar fashion. In 2020, nearly 1,000 large contractor-sized bags of plastic bottles were saved from going into the landfill. And for example, in places like Tuluksak, where they suffered an incident where their water plant basically was put out of commission, they also at the same time received a donation of 14,000 water bottles that were sent to the village. And so we worked with them and the local IGAP coordinator to get those empty bottles, to keep them out of their landfill and to get them into recycling. When it comes to aluminum cans in Anchorage, we've got a couple of programs here in Anchorage. We have the Can Do Kids program, what's done in cooperation with WestRock. And WestRock is the company that manages the Anchorage Recycling Center. And that's where school-age kids can drop off their aluminum cans and get paid for their collections and drop off their name for monthly prizes. And then in Anchorage, we also work with the municipality, the Anchorage School District, Alaska Waste, and several management companies to provide community recycling bins at about a dozen different locations across the city. So I know that's a lot. It's a lot of logistics, and it takes the expertise and the dedication of so many business partners along the way, and the municipalities also along the way, willing to dedicate their employees' time and their resources to the effort. And it takes Alpar negotiating these donated contracts to getting service agreements signed on a yearly basis to move all this material onto a new life. And just because it's donated, don't assume it doesn't come with paperwork. It takes a lot of time to manage all these different moving parts, but it's thanks through all this cooperation that we're able to do it. I haven't even really talked about our litter prevention yet, but I think I've already used up my time, so I'll probably need to turn it back over to Susanna.
Anita, thank you so much. Yeah, no, and thank you for going through all that, and yeah, just showing just kind of how complicated the whole system can be. I think folks don't really get that all the time. So yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, now we're gonna move on to our next speaker tonight, who is Jen Gordon. Jen is a communicator, a writer, sailor, lover of the ocean, outdoor enthusiast, yoga teacher, and mother. She's a 25-year resident of Alaska, and her passion for reducing plastic contaminations of the oceans has led to her current career as an entrepreneur, co-owner, and co-founder of Blue Market AK, Anchorage's first old world grocer, a refillery with a zero waste model and a commitment to community. As a green grocer, Blue Market AK specializes in food, personal care, and household cleaning products that are unpackaged in bulk or packaged in reusable or repurposed containers, aka no single-use plastics. Products are sourced from 45% Alaskan vendors, and all suppliers are carefully vetted based on their impacts to the planet and contributions to their community. Blue Market AK gives back to the Anchorage community with a 1% Giving Back program, free pop-up space for Alaskan makers, a containers lending library, and partnerships with like-minded groups who care about our planet. Jen, we're really excited to have you tonight.
Let me unmute. I will say I might be one of the very few people who isn't on Zoom all the time these days, so bear with me if I'm a little clunky with moving around. I want to play the slideshow. Okay, so hi everybody, I am Jen Gordon, and I am here to talk about the motto of our store is refill, not landfill. And so this is what I'm going to focus on is what can we do with the containers and the trash items that we have before they get to the recycle bin or the landfill. So first I'm going to start out with, this is just a yes or no, use your reaction buttons here to answer. What disposables, plastic or otherwise, do you use? What about Ziploc bags, yes or no? And I'm going to just kind of scroll through these pretty quickly. To-go food boxes, produce bags, to-go food utensils, coffee cups and those pesky little plastic lids. And I can't see anything here. Okay, garbage bags, bread bags, cellophane bags, the dreaded clamshells. I've got an idea of what you can do with those. That'll come up later. Cardboard packaging, like for crackers, it's better than single-use plastics, but it's still, what do you do with it afterwards? And granola bar or candy wrapping. So my guess is there should be a lot of yeses on the screen right now. I can't see you get all of your little bubbles, but all of us encounter disposable packaging in our daily lives. So how can we affect greenhouse gas emissions and solid waste by changing our shopping habits? This is the question that was posed to me by the group here. And so I'm going to try to tackle it. As I researched this, I found this awesome little chart. This is a graphic put out by Annie's Foods for a sustainability report that they performed in 2012. And what it does is it kind of marks out, this is what they found their carbon footprint allocation was across the life cycle of their products. And so there is carbon gas emissions in the materials production. So right from the get-go, that wheat that they grow to create the pasta and their mac and cheese and their crackers, that is the biggest producer of the greenhouse gas emissions. Interesting. Processing, distribution and shipping, packaging. So all of those you've probably thought of before. Here's some interesting ones. How we use it. So our cooking of our mac and cheese, for example, accounted for 19% of their gas emissions from the cradle to grave of their products. So that's interesting too. Anyway, so I liked this because it just breaks it out into these categories. And one thing to consider when you are a consumer and you're thinking, how can I affect greenhouse gas emissions by whether or not I buy this product? One way is to think about the materials or ingredients and the processing of those that go into it. So for example, wheat production, organic wheat production actually produces 40% lower global warming potential than conventional wheat production. So when you look at those two boxes, and one of them is organic and one of them is not, and it's a wheat product, you could significantly reduce your greenhouse gas emissions by purchasing the one that is the organically grown one. And that's because of the lack of chemicals they use and the production process that they use with wheat production versus organic versus non-organic. Just one example. Of course, packaging is something that you can consider. So the packaging, how much packaging is there for the item that you have in your hands? Can you get it? Is it possible to get it completely unpackaged? And if it has to be packaged, can you get it in something that is not too much packaging and is the kind of packaging that can be composted or recycled? Another thing you can ask yourself is, what was the shipping or distribution for this product? Did it come from Jamaica or did it come from Wasilla? So when you're looking at things that you're purchasing, you can consider all of these categories. And then the last thing, of course, can it be recycled? Can it be composted? Or is it going to become garbage? And so as consumers, we have the power to make choices. And these are some ways we can do it. So at Blue Market, when we started the store, one of our missions was that we would do the work for you. So you could come into our store, you come in the door, and you know that all of our vendors have been vetted with standards. And our standards are here on this poster, and they kind of match what I just saw, what we were just looking at with Annie's, but also we've added in some community-minded and humanitarian stuff as well. And so we have all these standards. There is not one single company that could have every single checkbox here. It's not possible. But we try to get locally produced products. We have 45% of our vendors create their products here in Alaska. We look at how vendors ship, and if they do ship, on a barge, how do they counteract that? Do they plant trees? Do they have a carbon neutral plan in their business plan? What kind of packaging do they use? When we receive a box of, let's say, salsas, do they pack it with a whole bunch of bubble wrap, or do they pack it in a different way? And we've actually found we can even educate companies, and they're starting to send us things in packaging that isn't so heinous to the environment. So we look at all these things, and then bottom line, we honestly believe that this zero waste mantra, some of you may have heard, is 1 million people doing it imperfectly is far more important than a few people doing it perfectly. So we try with baby steps to hit whatever piece of this puzzle we can. So rethinking is arguably the most important R. We love the reduce, reuse, recycle. Everybody knows this logo. Over the years, it's become recognizable worldwide. It's gotten us all thinking, I hope, all thinking about what we can do with something before we throw it in the garbage, right? I'd like to propose that we could consider even more than that. So when we rethink, number one of the first things we can do is refuse and reduce. So if it is the kind of time of year like now where there aren't any more local carrots, don't buy carrots for a few months until there are local carrots. Can you refuse something? Can you refuse that water bottle? It's possibly the most difficult one to accomplish because it means breaking habits that we're used to. The next one, rotting or composting, another R. Reusing and repurposing. Plastic, metal, cardboard, glass. Those bread bags are a great example. They can be reused for so many things. So if you're going to purchase them, if you can't help but have these in your home, how can you reuse them over and over and over again? You could also shop unpackaged or naked, like in our store, and bring your own containers in and fill them up. And I'll explain a little more about that in a moment. and recycling correctly. So it is so important that it's done the way it's meant to be done. And so you don't end up with, for example, those pizza boxes not broken down. So it makes it even harder. Shopping locally, we believe, is one of the biggest ways to make an impact in your community, not only economically, but in all sorts of ways. Locally made pasta can be bought here. You can bring your container, get just as much as you want and take it away. And the local maker brings it to us in a bin that he makes in that morning. So there are so many awesome businesses here in Alaska. I think part of it is because we are remote. So there are so many creative people. And this is only touching the beginning here, this list. My story is this, real quickly. This passion was born when in 2012, I sailed with my family, 8,000 nautical miles. We left Seldovia, Alaska. We went through Mexico and we saw so much plastic. Little coves like this in the middle of nowhere in Alaska, they look amazingly beautiful, and they are, but look closer and you find plastic pretty much everywhere. Anchorage Museum, this was from the Gyre exhibit, and you can see all the different countries where these plastic bits came from, in Gore Point, Alaska, which is just a point. 2 minutes on a Mexican beach, you can find a bag floating around and fill it up. So how many plastic bottles are you seeing this? I hope you're seeing this. I'm just going to be quiet for a moment and let it sink in. I'm going to stop because it's a little bit depressing, but 350,000 bottles since we opened this page. A challenge from a friend of mine. So when I got back from this trip, a friend of mine said, "I'm so sick of hearing you complain about the plastics everywhere. Will you shop for a month and don't buy any single-use plastics?" So I gave it a try. Oops. And I posted it on Facebook. Here's a picture of my grocery cart from Cars, where I got my, I went to get my meat from the butcher because I didn't want to buy it in the styrofoam and cellophane wrapped package. And I had to make sure they didn't put this wrapped paper in the butcher paper inside a plastic bag. And I couldn't do the cheese. I had to have cheese and I couldn't do it without plastic. So I tried this, I posted it on Facebook, and I got an enormous amount of reactions from people, hundreds and hundreds of comments and shares. So thus Blue Market AK was born. I met Jess shortly after that. A friend hooked us up and said, "You two have to talk because you want to do the same thing." We decided to try to open this store. It's an old world green grocer and refillery. Bring your containers in or use ours. We have a lending library where we collect your recyclable, your non-recyclables, or your any kind of jar container you have that you don't want in your home anymore and could be reused. We sanitize it and it's available to fill with all kinds of goods. Anything a grocery store would have, we've got in here, all the essentials. It's a zero waste philosophy, meaning all of our items in here are naked or packaged. We even have deodorant that has no container at all. You just put it under your arm like a bar of soap, but it's deodorant. And so it's convenient, eco-friendly choices for conscious consumers who wish to minimize waste, shop locally, give back. 1% of everything you spend here goes back to a cause. It's the Anchorage Waterways Council right now, and eliminate single-use plastics. Why do we do it? Because there are 5 trillion plastic bags used per year. That amounts to 700 per year per person. 50 billion water bottles are bought in the US per year. 8 million tons of plastic enters the ocean per year. That accounts for 5 trillion plastic pieces. And these are old statistics. Well, not old, but not brand new. And I hope it's better. I'm not sure. There's a lot of buzz. People care about this. We are constantly impressed with the feedback we get from people who come in for the first time, and they are so jazzed. They come in with their empty bottles all clinking and clanking in their bag, and they feel so good when they leave with their groceries. The municipal recycling and composting programs have come up. There are Buy Nothing Facebook groups. These are groups that are dedicated to not buying new things. Alaska Zero Waste has 1,500 followers. It's a Facebook group. It's super fun. People put out all kinds of information out there about how to try to live this minimal waste lifestyle. There are farm to table options. You can get milk out in the valley. You can get meats from the valley. More and more restaurants you'll see have items with locally produced foods. There's the UAF composting and food education programs that you'll hear about with the next speaker. There's Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace. And there are conscious retail stores popping up like ours, Sustainable Wares in Homer, and The Goods in Soldotna, and I think there's one out in Palmer, and it's happening, it's buzzy, and it's really exciting. It gives us a lot of hope. Local establishments are changing. You may have noticed that you don't see plastic straws that much anymore at a lot of the restaurants and bars that you go to. And the to-go packaging has even changed. So my call to action to all of you is to make conscious changes to your grocery shopping habits to reduce your purchasing of products that are packaged with single-use plastic. Just give it a try. Give yourself a week or a month or a couple of weeks, and don't beat yourself up if you can't do it. If you need that hunk of cheese and it's plastic, oh well, but what did you reduce? What did you eliminate? A little hint, one of the easiest things to do first is probably to stop using produce bags. Just put the produce right in your cart or put it in your own bag that you bring. Try to avoid the plastic bag. And then a secondary call to action is to take this practice, these new habits that you learn, that you perhaps can make them part of the way that you shop. How can these kind of changes become a middle out action for our community? So taking the baby steps to make changes in your personal shopping habits, and then coming up with ways that you can make that bigger. So a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, right? And if our reefs could look like this, and our oceans this clear and blue, wouldn't that just be a magical thing? And that's it. Thank you.
Jen, thank you so much for your presentation and for your commitment to waste reduction and plastic reduction here in Anchorage. It's really important to work on that, so thank you. Next, we're going to pivot a little bit more to food, and we're going to share a really short video explaining how our food waste footprint, explaining our food waste footprint, and then we're going to dive into a discussion on what we can do to keep the food that we aren't able to eat out of the landfill.
Each year, 1/3 of all the food the world produces is lost or wasted. Not only does this mean an economic loss, it means that all of the natural resources used for growing, processing, packaging, transporting, and marketing that food were also wasted. Imagine. 28% of the world's agricultural land grows crops that are wasted. That equals the total land area of China, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan. Plus the water wasted in growing those crops equals the annual flow rate of the Zambezi or the Volga rivers, an amount that could cover all the world's household water needs. And as agriculture and fisheries expand into wild areas, overexploit natural resources, forest and marine habitats are lost, along with their biodiversity. Above all, wasted food emits some 3.3 gigatons of greenhouse gases. If this were a country, it would represent the third largest emitting country in the world. This cannot continue. With a future of more people and fewer resources, we cannot afford to throw our natural resources out with the garbage. Let's do something about wastage. Food producers can invest in better harvest and storage technology to avoid food loss. Food retailers can reduce prices of that imperfectly shaped vegetable and donate unsellable yet edible surplus grocery food to those in need. Food not fit for human consumption should be reused to feed animals. Individual consumers can be more careful shoppers, use better methods to store and recycle leftovers, and request smaller portions in restaurants. Small efforts add up. The food wastage pyramid is based on garbage. Policymakers can enhance the ability of producers, retailers, and consumers to turn that pyramid around. For example, develop capacities of food producers to adopt post-harvest technologies. Revise those sell-by expiration dates so perfectly safe food is not discarded. Launch awareness-raising campaigns to inspire consumers to take whatever steps they can to stop food wastage. Reduce landfills through investments in transforming food waste into compost and biogas. The solution starts with you. Each producer, supermarket, household, restaurant, and nation has a part to play. It will take the commitment of all to reduce food loss and waste, so that all the natural resources used to produce food will end up as meals for the world's population, instead of as garbage in landfills.
All right. And with that, I'm really excited to introduce Jody Anderson to talk more about composting. Jody has been the director of the University of Alaska Fairbanks Matanuska Experiment Farm and Extension Center since August 2018. She started at UAF in 2003 and nearly completed a PhD in soil biochemistry. While at UAF, she began and managed the Alaska Community Horticulture Program, as well as research that focused on soil building, organic nitrogen soil supplements, compost development, and community gardening. Jody, I'm so excited to hear your presentation tonight.
Thanks so much. Susanna, I'm really excited to be here, and thank you all for inviting me. I think this is an important component of the conversation that we often forget to talk about. And so I really am appreciative that you guys have the vision to include composting in this discussion. So can I, Kari, could I get you to put the poll up really quickly? I've got a quick poll. Hopefully. We'll see. There it is. Just really quickly, I'm just asking you to fit. Where's your situation today regarding your organic waste? Are you interested in composting? Do you already compost? Do you wish that you could compost? Or are you not interested in composting at all? And don't worry, these are totally disconnected from your actual location or name and everything. So I'm not going to call on anybody, and there's no shaming. I'm just curious where everyone's at. That's probably good. Can we see the response? Holy mackerel, why am I even here, you guys? You guys already know this stuff. So great, that's awesome. Usually we don't start that way. I'm really excited that many of you are composters. In fact, the majority of you are composters. And so Kari has my presentation for me because I have some questionable internet here in Fairbanks. I'm actually not in Palmer today. So I'm gonna have her run my machine for me, and I really appreciate it. Thank you. So basically, if I could give you a very, very quick and high level idea about what composting is. Can I have the first slide, please? Or not.
It was there and then it went.
All right. Well, anyway, so what I want to start with is just the theory behind composting and what it is and why it's important to our conversation this evening. If I could have the next slide, please. There we go. Composting is part of this story, and you saw that in the video. I wish that my voice was as cool as that guy's voice was on the video before, but it isn't. So sorry, but I think it'll be okay. What I wanted to start with is the EPA finally recognized the importance of food, the enormity of food waste in America. And so they came up with this triangle, like, if all of us are of a certain age and beyond, we remember the food pyramid, where like the majority of your food was, that your consumption was at the bottom, and it went all the way to the peak at the top, which was supposed to be sugars. They've turned that pyramid upside down, and now we're working from the most preferred food recovery at the top, and then moving your way through toward the bottom, where the least preferred is actually throwing material in the landfill. And I think that the speakers this evening have done an amazing job of talking about all of the components, well, almost all of the components above, and how we're able to do that, and giving you some really tangible action items for the forward moving. But I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on composting and what it's like to home compost and what that actually means. Next slide, please. So composting is actually the human manipulation of a natural process, and that process is called decomposition. So you do not need inoculants in your compost. All of the bacteria and fungus that are going to do the job are already in everything that needs to be. They're already on your organic waste. They're already in the materials and on the materials. So you don't have to add anything to it. Nature's going to do its job. We created composting, humans created composting to actually get rid of volumes of organic material. And it started in India because of human waste. And there's something needed to be done with this vast amount of human waste. And by mixing it with carbon, they found that they could reduce it to a manageable size, and it became something that's actually usable for another purpose. And so composting became the taking a natural process, bulking it up, and then manipulating it in time so that it's a faster process and it's a more even process, is what composting is all about. And composting it's very much like cooking. The really cool part about composting is that there's about, 90% art to composting and 10% science. In all honesty, it's really just that simple. And so what I want to give you guys tonight is just enough information to be really dangerous. And then you can go crazy with your composting, because once you know the basics of composting, then you are going to create your compost pile based on your feedstock, what you feed it. This diagram here shows you what feedstocks you need. You need, on the far left, you have the high nitrogen, and you need that nitrogen in the left side. And for most of us, that's going to be our food products, our organic waste from the house. And then on the far right side is the carbon side. And we do need carbons. We need a lot of carbons to come into the pile. And sometimes if the pile has too many very, very small pieces, you need the middle component, which are called bulking agents, which are really just like big space holders, big blocky pieces of carbon, like wood chunks that aren't going to decompose in your pile because they're just too big, but they're going to create these pockets for oxygen to hang out. And they're going to also create these weird spaces so that all of your materials can mix more evenly and you get a better product. Can I have the next slide, please? So what are those feedstocks? What are we talking about when we talk about feedstocks? If anybody plays on the internet and looks up anything about composting, you're going to see this language called, that everybody talks about, greens and browns, and greens and browns and greens and browns. Well, that's okay. But I don't like using those terms because some greens are not green, the color green. They're actually brown. So we'll talk about this in a sec. Not to confuse you, but this is your recipe right here. And it's a very, very simple recipe. You need 3 parts carbon, or on the list, these are examples of browns or carbons. You need 3 parts carbon. You need 1 part nitrogen, and you need water, and you need oxygen. Now, if you remember the discussion earlier this evening talking about the methane gas production, and when you bury organic waste, it becomes anaerobic. What that means is the decomposition process is happening by bacteria that don't need oxygen for their energy. And so they use the next best thing, unfortunately, and their waste product is methane. So we want oxygen rich. We want aerobic environments in a compost pile. If any of you have ever, and you don't have to raise your hands, if any of you have ever made a pile and it stunk, it was gross, it was gooey and cold and smelly, your neighbors were angry, the ravens were eating it, you didn't have your balance right. So why do you need 3 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen? And here's the real reason. Here's the science. I'm going to give you the science. So every living thing, except, okay, of course, there are a few weird critters at the very bottom trenches of the Pacific Ocean that don't need oxygen. And I get that. And they don't live on carbon. I know, right? They're not carbon-based. But all the rest of us are carbon-based. We need carbon for our energy source. All living things. The bacteria need carbon for energy. So the carbon is being used for energy, just like we use it. Could you go back, please? Sorry. Thanks. We need that energy. The nitrogen is the really cool thing. You're right, Travis. I misspoke myself. I'm sorry. But yeah, there are some sulfur energy consumers at the bottom of the ocean. But the neat thing is that we need nitrogen as the base of all proteins, no matter if you're a single cell bacterium or a multicellular organism like a human being. So what we're doing in a compost pile is you are a zookeeper for bacteria and fungus. You are creating a perfect environment with lots of carbon, a little bit of nitrogen, water, and oxygen. And the bugs, your bugs, are going to be so happy that they're going to eat the carbon. They're going to use that nitrogen. They're also going to consume that nitrogen. You're going to see your pile decrease because the carbon is being consumed. The nitrogen is being consumed. You're releasing carbon dioxide, using oxygen in your pile, and you end up with a compost material that doesn't look like what it started to look like. It doesn't smell like it started. It smells like really gorgeous earth. It's very rich and alive. Next slide, please. This science that we're talking about, that I'm talking about all these bugs, this is the science. So for all my science nerds out there, I'm going to have my hand raised. It's okay. I'm with you. I see you. And this is for you. This is what your bacteria and your fungus, predominantly your bacteria at the beginning of your compost, they're eating so much carbon that they're going crazy. And you see how the very first rise comes and then it drops dramatically. That's when you turn your pile. Every time the temperature starts to drop, you turn your pile. You're mixing it up. You're bringing carbon from the outside of your pile to the inside of your pile, and you're getting it all mixed up. And you add water as you turn it. And then the temperature decreases again, and the temperature decreases again until the very, very end, you turn it. There's no temperature increase. You do that a couple times, you're done composting. You want to leave it for about another 6 months to a year. I know people hate me when I say it, but you're going to get more benefits from your compost if you let it sit. It's called curing. Next picture, please. So my call to action to all of you. I want you guys to figure out some things about the Muni composting system. A Muni compost, there's some really great things that are happening. We've seen them this evening presented. Learn about that, figure it out. You don't want to compost it, that's okay. You can do curbside pickup if you're in the right area. And forgive me, I don't live in the Muni, so I'm not sure all the details of that, but you guys have learned a whole lot this evening that you can figure this out. Support a friend's compost. I know this sounds really weird, but there are people out there that are able to, they're really good composters. Take them some of your stuff and ask them if you could help them turn it. Learn from them, help them, and then take some back with you. And then if you want, figure it out and learn more yourself. You can do that. It's very easy. It's not a difficult process, and it's actually a lot of fun. I mean, who doesn't want to be a zookeeper? I mean, it's amazing. And so I apologize that this is such a rushed thing, but I did want to just give you some high-level information. And the greatest thing about compost, and trust me, I can do it, you can't kill a compost pile. That's the very best part. You can beat it up and it can slow down, but it won't die. You can wake it back up again and everything will be fine. So if any of you have very specific questions and are interested, please feel free to touch base with me. My email address is there on the screen. I'd be happy to answer you. That's my work email address, and I am located out at the farm in Palmer. And I'm really excited to be part of this group, and thanks so much for thinking beyond just the landfill, but also about how we can do this at home as well. Thank you.
Jody, thank you so much. That is so interesting and so great and so helpful. Yeah, just like kind of the quick guide to home composting. And thank you so much for, the call to action at the end is so right. If you do have the ability to compost at home, when you're thinking about your emissions and the transportation of all that, I mean, yeah, home composting is going to have, the least amount of emissions, right? If you're not having to have a garbage truck come pick up your stuff. But yeah, recognizing that not everyone has access to that. And that's why the Muni is working so hard to develop these programs, because we do know there's a lot of people, maybe they don't have a backyard, or, they just don't have the time or whatever. So we want to make sure that folks still have the ability to keep this out of the landfill. So yeah, thank you so much. So now we're going to turn to questions. We've been compiling this all night. We have a few minutes to answer a few questions. If you do have a question about anything you've heard tonight, please enter it into the chat. We are monitoring that, and we'll try to get to it when we can. Jody, since you just went, I was hoping to actually start with you. We did have a question about what is the best home compost system for Alaskans in the winter? And I myself am quite curious about how can we keep composting going in the winter?
So there are two answers. The first is keep your pile huge. So I have, there's a gentleman who owns beef cattle in Kenny Lake, and he composts year round, and it gets 40, 50 below. But he also has a volume that maintains a critical mass to the point that it doesn't freeze in the core, which is that's the most important piece. And so you either build a giant one, which is for most of us home composters is not practical. The other option is freeze your organic stuff. Like put a bucket outside, drop the stuff in there. It's going to stink. I'm just going to let you know, because it's going to start decomposing on its own without help. You're going to add carbon to it in the springtime, and that pile is just going to go nuts. As a home composter, you can collect your organic material throughout the winter, freeze it. It's gross. I mean, it just is. And yeah, it is. It's just like Elizabeth just said. It's like I have a stinky bucket outside my door, and that's what you do, is you just keep dropping things in. The real critical thing about your piles, however, and this is where most backyard, especially small piles, people who add to their piles, like they'll take all of their stuff and they'll put it together for the week and drop it in their pile. You're starting your pile from scratch. You're never going to get finished compost if you keep adding to your pile all the time. So get enough material to build one pile, build the pile, let it go, and then collect material again, build another pile and let it go.
Awesome. Nope, that's so good to know. Thank you. There's another question, and it is it's in the composting realm, but it's slightly different. Someone was asking about some takeout food is coming in compostable containers, but the Muni doesn't accept those containers in the community compost program. And they're asking, why is that? And are there other uses for those containers, or do they have to wind up in a landfill? So I can answer the first part of that question. The reason why the Muni doesn't take these compostable containers is we work with a composter actually located out in Palmer. They have very minimal processing when it comes to the composting that they're doing out there. And with all of these compostable containers, especially the ones that are sort of the plasticky compostable containers, it requires additional processing and additional heat that has to be applied, like during the process. It takes longer. It's pretty complicated. And we just don't have that system yet here in South Central Alaska. So one thing the Muni is working on right now is we're doing a feasibility study looking at what it would take to have a composting facility here in Anchorage, because we do want to make it more local. And one of the things we're looking at is how can we develop infrastructure to accept those compostable containers, because they are everywhere. But Jen, I'm wondering, do you have any comments on what folks could do with a compostable container if they can't recycle it or compost it?
Sure. So am I unmuted? Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I wish I could walk around here and show you all the different size and shape containers that we have in here. Like I said, I forgot to mention about the clamshells. So the clamshell is one of those that's not compostable. They don't really want it to be recycled either, and it's going to last forever and ever and ever in our landfill, which goes to the ocean, right? You could bring it here. So what we do now, we've provided this space where we have seeds of change, greens and fresh herbs every week. We get them twice a week. So bring your clamshells here and fill them up. And so what can you do with those containers that are not compostable, that are not recyclable? You can bring some of them here, and we sanitize them and leave them for our customers to use. And just try to be super creative. A friend of mine the other day posted a picture. She planted all of her seeds in K-cups that she collected at work, and she can't stand that they're there and they make her sad, but she poked holes in the bottom, and she has these beautiful K-cup seed starts going now, and she put it inside like some kind of a to-go container that she hung on to with a clear lid to make it like a tiny terrarium. So I think we can be creative about what we do with those packages.
Yeah, definitely. No, those are all really great options. And yeah, I would also point back to the calls for action that Jen had earlier. And I talked about trying to reduce those, right? When you can, try not to get them if at all possible. So just a good thing to think about. But yeah, if you do get them, there are some options for them. So I did see there were a few questions in here about plastics recycling, and specifically, why are only specific plastics accepted for recycling here in Anchorage? Anita, I don't know if you might be able to speak a little bit about sort of the market situation and why we only accept number 1 and number 2 plastics here.
Sure. Yeah. So number 1s and number 2s, I guess what I can tell you is that they're the most valuable, right? As far as a commodity, those are the ones that are most used. Those are the ones that the processors, when they're making something new, most often ask for. And so, for example, with the number 1s and 2s, those can be like, say, for example, up to a value of $1,000 per ton. Whereas numbers 3 through 7, those are less valuable to most of the producers right now. And they are actually having to pay. They're having to pay for those types of plastics to be taken away. So that's the volume and value balance that we talk about. So that's why you see number 1s and 2s most often being collected. They're the most used and the most valuable to the commodities market and those people that are buying it.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's another question, Anita, I was hoping you might be able to touch on too. So, someone was asking about why don't we have more manufacturing options up here? Why don't we have aluminum smelting, that sort of thing, so we can keep recycling here? They asked too, is it because we have too little volume, or what's the situation there?
Yeah, and I know that we had chatted a little bit offline the other day, Susanna, about this. And so a large part of what kind of makes recycling happen and being able to get all these recyclables together is right now we have a single stream system right now in Anchorage. And so that's going to other places to be sorted. Now, do we have the volume and enough people just within the municipality here to have our own materials recovery sorting facility? It sounds like perhaps the municipality's done a little bit of investigative work right now, and maybe we're kind of on the bubble of that. But for right now, it's not being done, but that doesn't mean that there's not great things happening, right? So in the Valley Thermocool of Alaska, they make cellulose insulation using 85% locally sourced materials like newsprint and cardboard and they create insulation with construction projects. So I'm not really sure if that's true manufacturing in the sense the person was asking the question, but it does happen in that sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I do know there was a question in there too. Someone was asking about what happens with the curbside recycling and do we sort it here? And I can answer that. I didn't really go in the details here, but we don't actually sort any of the curbside recycling here in Alaska. With curbside recycling, you need a specialized facility. It's called a materials recovery facility. And it's a big building. It has lots of conveyor belts and magnets and lasers and all kinds of equipment that actually sorts through all of the recyclables that are coming in. They just come in on a sort line. And the way it works here in Alaska is that we just take all of your commingled recycling, we pick it up in the recycle truck, we take it to the recycle center, it gets baled at the recycling center, and then it just gets shipped down as it is to the Tacoma area where there is what we call it a MRF, is the acronym MRF, where then it is all getting sorted. And then from that, those materials are going to the different manufacturers who are making recycled products out of the sorted materials. So that's one of the reasons why we talk so much about contamination in recycling and why we don't want you to put things into your curbside recycling that can't be recycled, or doing wish cycling where maybe you're throwing your plastic bags in there, or plastics are really bad. There's a lot of confusion about plastics. Those just end up getting shipped down to the lower 48 for trash, which is why we really don't want folks to put those into the curbside recycling. But yeah, it's an interesting and sort of complicated picture for how that all works. So, well, with that, we're coming up on the end of our time here. I'm really thankful for all the presenters tonight. It was also wonderful. I would just remind folks of all of the calls to action that we had tonight in terms of how we can improve our consumption and solid waste habits. Again, going back to that reduce, reuse, recycle. You hear it all the time. Maybe it sounds boring, but it really is important. And so I would just encourage you to keep doing it. I'd also note that if you have questions about anything that you've heard tonight, there are a lot of really great resources on the Alaska Common Grounds website. And a recording of this event will also be posted there as well. So with that, I thank you all so much for your time. It's been a really great conversation, and I will hand this back to Dick.
Thank you, Susanna. And thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Jody, for this very interesting, informative discussion. I'm going to work on changing my compost pile to be more productive. start throwing my newspapers in there. Missing from this event is the sound of the applause that everyone watching tonight will be happy to give you. Special thanks to Kari Gardy, who has been running the Zoom show for this evening, and with Stacia McGordy from Anchorage Public Library, who has been helping behind the scenes. This event has been organized by co-chairs Kari Gardy and Mary Lou Harrell, co-chairs of the work group, and along with awesome committee members, including Peg Tileston and Common Ground members, Gretchen Nelson, Cami Dalton, Betsy Baker, and Shara Sutherland. Thank you for your support in attending this evening. If you are not a member, please go to our website, alaskacommonground.org, or join by making a donation to support Alaska Common Ground's work towards an engaged Alaska democracy. This is the last event in this series, at least for this season. We will be planning future events discussing climate and how we can all get involved. Stay tuned for more information. We'll send out emails for upcoming events. Again, no events planned in the immediate future. We're going to kind of take it easy, hopefully this summer, because we had quite a few events the past season. Please stay healthy, stay engaged, join Alaska Common Ground, and have a good evening. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.